Welcome, guys, to Professor's Opinion. So, I did take a tiny, I wouldn't say tiny, I guess, but it's been a few months since I uploaded any videos on the channel. And today I want to come back and do I guess, a lot of questions I get asked when I discuss geopolitics and how they impact financial markets and how you can take advantage of that if you understand geopolitics well. I think people fail to understand the role of energy in determining how geopolitical factions are formed around the world. So, the whole saying that money talks. And yeah, if you want to know where the power centers lie, the true centers of power, not the ones that the media tell you, but if you want to know where the true centers of powers lie, you just have to follow where the money is going and who's controlling the money and who has the most of it, I guess, to put it simply. And so, like, I get a lot of questions of what's like people are confused about the Middle East and how Saudi, Qatar, Kuwait, all these Arab, Western allied Arab countries, what their future looks like, why Trump likes them so much, and how much sway do they have in US politics or how much influence do they have over US government. And a lot of people online have seen, especially after the Iran-Israel war, Israel attacked Qatar recently, right? Doha. So people are saying, okay, these are just puppets of USA. These Arab countries don't really have any influence or sway of power. They're just puppets of USA. But I think what people are, I guess, failing to grasp is that you can't fight with your banker, if that makes sense. If you go through history, the person who was doing the banking for the country or the institution that was doing the most of the banking for any country, the country was more or less beholden to those kind of institutions. If you want to talk about the British during the Second World War, they took a lot of debt from USA, and so they were beholden to US interest. And you can talk about Napoleon's War and Waterloo, it was financed by the Rothschilds, right? And so the Rothschilds banking network financed the war between the British and the French in the Napoleon Wars. And yeah, the Rothschilds had a lot of sway over those governments and still do. And the idea is quite simple. And the logic behind it is quite simple, is that the Rothschilds own most of the debt of these countries, governments. And so when you're the majority owner of debt of any country, you're gonna have sway over that country's policies because like I said, money talks. That's how it is, especially if you're a lender, and especially if you're a lender of last resort, right? So nowadays, I mean, the last 1 century, you can say approximately, the Western countries have been getting most of their energy from the Middle East. Okay, that's just, I mean, yeah, America has increased its output now. I mean, sure, it's energy independent, but it I mean, I guess it's energy independent in the way that it has its own energy supply to meet its demand, but it's not economically, if in terms of economical sustainability of this model, it's not independent because the price of the ex oil that's extracted, the WTI, the Western Texas Intermediate, um, it's the cost of extraction, the marginal cost is much higher than extracting a barrel of oil in Middle East or anywhere else, or in Russia or anywhere else around the world. So it's much, much higher in North America, in USA. And same goes to Canada. I mean, yeah, Canada has oil, the third largest oil reserves, oil sands, or whatever you want to call it, in Alberta. But it's so expensive and polluting to extract this oil. Like, it's not a sustainable way to extract resource for your country. So Canada, USA, they do have oil, but they still buy Saudi oil, Middle Eastern oil, because it's cheaper, it's better quality, and that's just how it is. And So what happens? Energy, if for any country, even for just if you think about any household, um, other than your rent, if you own the apartment, house, wherever you live, other than that, what's your biggest expense? Sure, food. Okay. And what's the second one? Energy. It's your electricity bill, water, whatever you want to call it, all this energy that are that you need. Same goes for a country. Okay, your country needs energy to produce food, and a country needs energy to do a lot more than a household does need energy for, because there's industrial sectors and all that. And so Saudi and all these Middle Eastern countries, they have been just accumulating these US dollar treasury bonds for so long by just selling this cheap oil. So they, intentionally or unintentionally, they became the banker of the world, the banker of the Western world, at least. So even though Israel, it's a kind of a rogue nation, but even though they, I mean, bombed Doha recently, but I think that still doesn't change the fact that, these Middle Eastern, Arab, Western allied countries are the bankers of the Western world. I don't know if you guys know, but I mean, 2 years back, I think it was, 2023, there was this huge crash in the US debt market. All those cheap zero interest bonds they sold during the 2020 crash. Those became basically valueless as the interest rates rose up, bond coupon price went down. And what a lot of people don't know about that, major, minor crash, whatever you want to call it. Jane Street and some few banks went bust. I mean, I saw that, but I think what people don't know is so the bonds. So you have this bunch of banks holding those bonds, and then they had to sell them to shore up liquidity for their panicked customers, right? That's what happened. There was a Silicon Valley Bank, and then there was Chain Street in New York, I think. So, but what they end up doing is selling these bonds at such a discounted price. And guess who bought them? Guess who bought those bonds? Because if you think it was JP Morgan or, you know, any other major big banks in the USA, that's not the case at all. They didn't step in this time. Even if they wanted to, they couldn't because it just they're diversifying their risk away from US bond because you have to understand the big banks in USA are you know, not legally or contractually, but unofficially obligated to buy a certain amount of US government bonds. It's a Ponzi scheme. You have to be part of the scheme if you want your bank to run. So they were kind of forced buying those bonds in the past, but now you have they don't have to buy those bonds anymore, right? So now they're like, nah, we're not gonna touch these cheap bonds. And so what ended up happening was a lot of these Arab countries ended up buying these bonds. And then the next phase came when China dumped a significant portion of the US Treasury bonds to, I think, Saudi Arabia. Again, it was last year, I think, or 2 years back. So this has been happening for a while. This is not something that started this year under Trump. The decline of, USA has been going around for a while. And so that's how these Middle Eastern countries became the biggest bankers, the biggest lenders, the lender of last resort for USA and the Western world. And the Russian war forced more European countries to buy from Middle Eastern Arab countries. So then that way the European countries basically became in debt to the Middle Eastern countries. Now, the reason I'm saying this is there will be a war in Europe for sure between Russia and Western Europe. My It's not up to me to decide when that war will happen. I guess it's not up to me to forecast that. But what I'm trying to understand is who's going to be the banker of that war, because it's not going to be USA. What money is the USA going to lend to Europe? It doesn't have money for itself. Okay, it's not who's what kind of money can it lend? But who can lend money to Europe? It has to be a reliable customer or reliable partner that Europe believes in, supports. It will be most likely Middle Eastern, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, whatever you name it. All these North African and Middle Eastern oil-rich countries that have been selling oil to Western Europe recently. a lot significantly higher than before, right? So when the war will happen, you'll see more and more of these Middle Eastern countries' interests being brought in front of these Western European countries. Okay? And you have to understand that's why Trump loves Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and all this. It's because they're the lender of last resort and they're the biggest purchaser of US Treasury bonds, one of the biggest. And people might say, oh, that's not true. If you look at the public data, most of the US Treasury bonds are held by American institutions, blah, blah, blah. But that data doesn't talk about a lot of stuff. It gives you the bigger picture, which is great, but it doesn't mention about the bond swap agreements, the treasury default swap agreements that they have, that these countries have. Like you have to understand, when Saudi um they bought those bonds, technically bought those treasury US treasury bonds from China. They didn't just go out in the market and told China to dump them there and they'll buy it. No, what they did was they did a bond swap. So they swapped their other bonds for the US Treasury bonds. Okay. So they had bonds in other currencies and they swapped them for the US Treasury bonds from China. So that's why you didn't see any impact in the market because it was a completely private swap agreement, which is not going to be covered by your public stats like who owns the most debt of USA and all that stuff. So on paper, China still owns $1 trillion of US debt, but in reality, it probably doesn't. Probably much lower because China definitely hedged its risk already, the way it's talking. Okay, so that's one thing. So that's how this Arab Middle Eastern countries became the banker of the Western world. And as they gain more and more influence over this Western world, they'll end up having a better sway in how these governments are run in this Western world. So yeah, uh, in terms of countries like China, India, well, China was and still, I mean, it's not anymore, but it was a big banker for US Treasury bonds, right? Big lender to USA, but it's going the other direction. It's swapping those bonds to other countries, right? So I guess so that's the Western world. They're ta being taken over by these Middle Eastern Arab countries, in terms of the political and influence over the governments of these Western countries, right? Well, people usually fight back when I make this argument by saying that, well, I mean, Canada has a lot of resources. We don't need this, what do you mean Middle East is becoming our banker? We have Canada. They have a lot of resources. Yeah, they do, but how much have they actually succeeded in extracting at an economically feasible manner is the big question. Okay, yes, they did a transmountain pipeline expansion after 15 years. So much budget overruns and still not a single drop of gas. I mean, two or three tankers, I guess, has moved to Asia from there, but it's still not fully operational. And even if it was fully operational, it's not anywhere near the amount of LNG Russia or the Middle Eastern players ship out around the world. Okay. And the problem in Canada is un it's a beautiful place to stay, but it's a very challenging environment. The natural environment is a very challenging environment. So any infrastructure plan, and you have to understand, it's the second biggest country with only 30 million or 40 million people. And you need people to carry these projects. You can't just use AI and automation. And yeah, so Canada has a long way to go before anything happens, and most of Canada is just frozen land, if which a lot of people fail to understand. Like 50% of Canada's population live close to the US border, because north of that is just frozen land. You can't do much over there. So yeah, and I talked about the oil sands being polluting and expensive to extract, so it's completely pointless to bring Canada into this discussion as a major player. Even though Mark Carney is trying to do that, but I highly doubt and that's gonna work because people are not stupid. There's much cheaper way to extract those resources in other places around the world. So yeah, and so that's the Western world. In terms of the Eastern world, this is where China became a bit more, I guess, they hedge their bets, so they have to purchase a large quantities, and they still have to purchase large quantities of energy. So they focus on the Middle East, they focus on Russia, they do their own extractions around the world with their own petroleum companies, state-run, right? So in that way, China did not let any one country become their central banker or their main banker, right? So that's one thing. And this is where India kind of lost the plot because India bought so much Russian oil in the last few years, and most of that has been in rupee, yuan. The Russian government has so much yuan, sorry, so much rupee in Indian banks. They don't know what to do with it. They're setting up factories in India, they're bringing the technical expertise, they're in deploying those Indian rupees to extract goods from India. And what ended up happening is Russia is slowly and steadily becoming the big banker of India. I mean, India is trying to diversify now, but I think that's where one area where Modi did not understand the technicality of what would happen if you buy so much oil from one country, because then you're beholden to the financial interests of those countries, right? Because so much of your currency is owned by that country, right? And I think that's where India kind of messed up. And they're kind of paying the price now because even if they want, they can't just sway away from Russia right now, right? They have so much obligations. And yeah, in terms of Russia, well, I mean, Russia's plan was to be the banker of Europe by selling all those cheap energy to Western Europe, but that didn't work out. What ended up happening was the oil energy they sold to Western Europe, the money they received, it ended up being frozen in Western Europe. So that plan didn't work out, and now they're selling to India. The problem with Russia is they have a lot of cheap energy, but they don't have a solid financial network to sell that energy and bring the money home. Okay, that's the fundamental issue with Russia. They sell energy to Europe. They have to do it in the European financial network because they don't have a reliable network of their own. So they have to put their own reserves in Eastern European banks, which ended up being frozen. Same with India. They have to trade in the Indian rupee when they sell their oil to India. The Indian rupee, it's not frozen, but they can't extract the Indian rupee into ruble and bring the money back home because there is no stable network to do that. You'll have to, if they try to dump all those rupees into rubles or yuan, you'll see a major crash in the rupee. So there's no strong financial stable network to bring those wealth back. So they have to now invest those wealth in India, go through all the bureaucracy, and hopefully gets a return on that investment in a few years. And so you understand why it's tricky. And yeah, so what ends up happening is the Western world is more united in the sense that they have one banker, which is the Middle East, because they've been buying so much energy from the Middle East for so long. The Eastern world, you have players like India who are kind of beholden to Russian interest, but not completely. And then you have wannabe bankers like Russia that just can't get their financial network system up and running in a reliable, integrated, respectable, trustworthy manner, right? That's basically the problem with Russia. In terms of China, I mean, China is well diversified. They're a banker of their own system. They extract wealth from other countries through manufacturing, goods selling, right? And so they're a banker in their own sense to a lot of countries. They're becoming the lender of last resort, the biggest banker in a lot of countries in this global south. And yeah, so if you want to know who, like I said, if I go back to the intention behind this video, which was to know where the power centers lie. Okay, the power centers lie wherever the banking is being done the most. Okay, so obviously the future power centers and the current power centers are in Doha, Dubai, Riyadh, Beijing, Moscow to a certain extent, and Delhi is becoming an up and coming power center in the sense that they're getting all these remittances from all these people they send abroad. So they're extracting wealth from other countries, not through energy, but through exporting manpower. So it's a future power center to a much less extent. But yeah, if you wanna know where the world is going, who's gonna make the big influencing decisions, focus on the actions of these Middle Eastern countries and China, because these Middle Eastern Arab countries and China are the biggest lender around the world. It's not USA, it's not Europe, it's not even Russia. And so they're the lender, and the lender have the last say in any conversation. So this two factions, the Middle East, you have to understand these Middle Eastern Arab countries, they don't like the Western countries. To them, the Western countries are a client. That's it. Okay? They don't like the Western culture. They don't really like these Western countries. They just want to buy up those assets in the Western countries before the countries go down, basically. And yeah, so that's what's happening. And yeah, that's it for this video. And I hope you guys subscribe. I'll make another video on another topic pretty soon. So until then, peace.